Welcome to Aprika Presents. Today's presentation is by Dr. Kenneth Moore. Apologies, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'll be narrating the first part of this, but you won't be missing much. His presentation considers where the best places to live during a time of climate change. The states in the U.S. least affected by climate change include the New England and Midwest regions, with states such as Vermont and New Hampshire remaining exceptionally natural disaster-free. If there's any lesson that we have learned from Helene and other storms and disasters, it's that we used to think of climate change as being something that would happen elsewhere, sometime in the future, and with somebody else's problem to worry about. And none of those things are true. It's here, it's happening where you live, and nobody's coming to save you. You have got to be part of the solution in your own life. Let's watch a video clip.
One of the things that we know is that the most vulnerable parts of our community are communities of color, elderly, children under 5, and the poor, irrespective of color. And so that's what this captures. So one of the things that immediately jumps out to me is this region in the South of purple, high vulnerability. That's the well-known black belt of the South. You also see areas of vulnerability in Florida that are likely tied to the elderly community that tends to retire in Florida.
Before we dive into the results of his map and learn what areas are most vulnerable to climate hazards, I wanted to explore how the models predict these extreme events will change as the climate warms. One of the most obvious changes? Temperature.
So with global warming, we're seeing not only increases in average temperatures or baseline temperatures, but also in extreme temperatures. So we're seeing unprecedented instances of record-breaking heat.
The Southeast and Southwest already experience extreme heat, but that heat is going to get a lot worse in the next 30 years, with parts of Louisiana, Texas, and Florida experiencing over 100 days reaching over 100 degrees a year. And days over 125 degrees used to be virtually non-existent, but by 2053, large areas of the country are expected to have at least one day a year reaching that incredible extreme. And at that temperature, a prolonged power outage could cause mass mortality.
We should not be surprised by warmest summers on record, warmest winters on record, or warmest year on record. I think we'll see that story over and over and over again.
If you Google climate change, you get images of polar bears on melting sea ice, and you get images of drought. A lot of people assume that a warming world means less water. But as I've learned from talking to experts throughout the series, the future of precipitation is a lot more complicated.
In fact, for every degree of warming, the atmosphere holds 7% warm moisture. With the exception of the Southwest, much of the country is expected to get wetter on average, but it's often the extremes that impact people and homes.
A 2024 study showed how extreme precipitation events are expected to get worse as the climate warms. 53 million people currently live in high-risk areas, but that number could double with 2 degrees of warming.
And so what we see is that the atmosphere not only can produce more extreme precipitation events, but can also result in more intensive or faster evaporation when there's moisture available to evaporate.
So that means both more rain and more drought. And while they are more difficult to model, hurricanes and wildfires are causing catastrophic damage in our warming world. In the last decade, wildfires have caused hundreds of billions of dollars of damage across the West and parts of the Southeast, and hurricanes have devastated coastal communities. And sea level rise will be a big threat along the whole eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast. But of course, we don't all experience these hazards equally, and that's exactly what Marshall wanted to show in his climate risk map.
The areas that are popping out to me,
Yes.
obviously Florida,
Exactly.
California,
Yep.
the Gulf Coast.
Gulf Coast.
Let's talk about Florida first.
Very vulnerable to sea level rise, very vulnerable to heat, but also an elderly, aging population as well. There's an envelope of temperature, humidity that human beings are comfortable living, and we get outside of that, it causes heat risk and potential death. We are seeing days or even weeks where temperatures and humidity combined are outside of that envelope of habitability for humans. In addition to, remember that exposure term we talked about, not only the people, but the infrastructure. This is sort of petrochemical alley, a lot of industry in here. So when we bring that together, you get high risk.
We know that the deserts southwest in California are vulnerable to drought, extreme rainfall, and water scarcity. And extreme precipitation and flooding is also a big hazard in the densely populated Northeast. But cities, Marshall found, were particularly vulnerable.
Let's use Atlanta. Let's break this down. Extreme flooding is not just the function of what falls from the sky as rainfall, but Atlanta also has a significant urban footprint in terms of impervious surfaces. So what that does is when we get these more intense rainstorms, the rain falls, it doesn't infiltrate into the soil, it runs off rapidly into streams and creeks and you get flooding. And those surfaces are hot. And so they absorb heat and re-radiate that at night, and we get the urban heat island.
So, in your opinion, what is the place that is most at risk?
This is a very skewed scale. It goes from 0.5 to 20. So South Florida, parts of the mouth of the Mississippi near New Orleans, and Los Angeles County, they're screaming at us for help.
I mean, I love this map. It really drives home the fact that, adaptation and mitigation and resiliency is so important.
Yeah,
and it's going to continue to be important because we're moving into the riskiest areas.
Yeah, we're there. We're living this map. The map shows that climate variability and climate vulnerability is present in almost every county in the United States. There's no safe haven to climate change, I would say.
Each colored label on this map shows the most frequent cause of weather fatalities within the National Weather Service's county warning area during the 20-year period from 1999 to 2018. I should note that although extreme heat is the leading cause of weather-related death, extreme cold is especially deadly in many northern areas of the country, as well as in the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma. But on average, extreme heat is the deadliest type of weather in the US, killing 130 people each year, according to NOAA. This is especially true in parts of the mid-Atlantic, Midwest, Southern Plains, and Southwest, including Southern California. Flooding is the second deadliest type of weather in the US, with an average of 81 deaths per year. This is the top cause in various portions of the central and eastern US, as well as the southern Rockies and southern High Plains. Tornadoes follow closely behind in third place with an average of 70 deaths per year. Parts of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee are particularly vulnerable to strong tornadoes in the spring. All of these weather conditions are exacerbated as global temperatures continue to rise with climate change. No one wants to believe that their daily activities, such as burning fossil fuels as you drive somewhere or as you heat your home, are responsible for a global disaster that has already turned millions of people into climate refugees and killed scores of others. None of us can afford to plan our futures as if all this upheaval isn't happening. Inattention is about to become very costly. Ken thought this was an interesting world map.
In that the parts of the world that are least at risk and those that are most at risk. And hopefully you'll notice that the continent of Africa is pretty beet red. North America, Europe, Australia, not so bad. So we're fortunate to be living where we are, but on the other hand, our actions are having a very uh, adverse effect on some of the poorest and those that are not contributing to the climate crisis. So we'll move on. Where to move once climate change makes parts of the U.S. uninhabitable? And as
This FEMA map shows the U.S. counties most at risk for natural disaster. 15 of the 18 natural disasters considered by this map are weather-related and thus influenced by climate change. The hotter the color in the map, the riskier it is in terms of natural disasters. Placer County, with its yellow coloration on the map, is riskier than 89% of the whole United States, but is only 28% riskier than the rest of California. In particular, Placer County scores relatively high for heat waves and wildfire. Climate change means more days with high temperatures, so be prepared. Don't let extreme heat turn into an emergency. This isn't true for everywhere in California. After all, we're a very big state. For example,
For San Francisco, by 2050, uh, it's only expected to have just 3 days of extreme heat per year. So things aren't bad in San Francisco as far as suffering from heat. But okay, now we're getting to California, and many California communities will experience more health-threatening heat by 2050. Now, this is back on the last 4th of July, and uh, for our part of the world, we're looking at 30 days or so over 100 degrees come 2050, which is not great, but not necessarily life threatening, and not nearly as bad as certain parts of the country. So we will move on. Uh, Increasing drought is going to result in very severe precipitation events. And for 23-24, the total economic loss from flooding in California was $15 billion. So it's a problem in California, but as we'll see from another one of the graphs here, California is rated among the top 10 uh, states in the country as being among the least threatened by flooding. Community resilience is the ability of a community to prepare for anticipated natural hazards, and Placer County's resilience is rated as very high. So that's good news for those of us who live in Placer County. And a lot of that is due to our excellent uh, Placer County uh, government that is taking, and Auburn City is taking climate change seriously and trying to make our community more resilient. Social vulnerability is the susceptibility of social groups to the adverse impacts of natural hazards, including disproportionate death, injury, and loss. And Placer County is rated very low. So, again, some good news about Placer County. And the bad news is we're under, uh, like much of the West, under the threat of wildfire risk. And that's why it's very important that we do all of our all the things that we can to provide defensible space and work to make ourselves more resilient in the face of the threat of wildfire. And so, uh, things that we can do is to get ready, to get set, and to be ready to go. And I think you've all heard about these things about defensible space and hardening our homes and so on. There are things that we can do to address the wildfire risk. As I was mentioning earlier, here's a graph that rates the 10 highest and the 10 lowest states for the risk of inland flooding. And interestingly, California rates among the 10 lowest. But in spite of being one of the 10 lowest, we still had $15 billion worth of damage from flooding because we happen to be a highly populous state. And so when you have a high population, when a flood comes through, it can do a lot of damage to a lot of property and do a lot of numerical damage. Okay. One of the things that we have in Placer County is something that's called Placer Alert. If you're not familiar with that, it's a way that our county is partnering with other counties in the region to provide important safety information to folks. And so I expect as time goes on, we'll hear more and more about Placer Alert and can be tuned in so that we're aware when they recognize any threats that we need to be attentive to. And now we'll move on, and here's our next video.
In 2021, just 1 year, nearly 1 in 10 homes in the US were impacted by natural hazards. And many places with the highest climate risk in the US are also seeing some of the highest growth.
When we ask home buyers and sellers directly, is climate change impacting your decision to buy a home, to move to a particular location? It's yes, the answer is yes. But then when you look at the macro trends of where people are actually moving, they're moving into harm's way.
Here's the thing. A quick search for weather hazards in just about any geographic location will bring up news of disasters and dire predictions of worse to come. So, how can we make informed decisions about where to live and how to manage risk? It turns out that even though some places will face far more hazards as the climate warms, identifying the riskiest places in the future is really hard. Take Alexander Pishlaris as an example. In 2020, he was living in Portland, Oregon, and the wildfires and smoke of that summer got so bad that he decided to move to Florida. But when his car nearly flooded while driving through Miami Beach during heavy rain, he realized he hadn't escaped his weather woes. So we worked with some of the best minds in this space to help us sift through the data, find where hazards overlap, and map out the riskiest places in the US. And stay with us to find out where we think the single riskiest place might be. As extreme weather increases all over the country, how do we figure out the riskiest places? First, let's look at the safest places. These are the safest 10% of counties in the US based on projections of how climate will change by the middle of the century. As the humid climate niche characterized by mean annual temperatures around 55 degrees Fahrenheit moves north, some places that are particularly cold now might actually get safer because, as we know from previous episodes, the most deadly weather in the US is extreme cold. This ProPublica study also lists the most dangerous US counties, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's add to our map mid-century projections for flood, storm, fire, drought, and heat risk. Starting with one of the most local hazards, flooding. This map shows the number of properties impacted by future floods due to rain, overflowing rivers, high tides, and storm surge. Many coastal towns will be impacted by rising sea levels, and places like West Virginia will be slammed with heavy rain as the climate warms. According to Redfin, by 2050, 84% of properties in Cape Coral, Florida, and 98% of properties in New Orleans will be at risk for flooding. Houston is also an outlier on this list due to the sheer number of properties at risk, as we saw when Hurricane Harvey submerged the city under its record-shattering rains in 2017. But what about storms? It seems like these extreme precipitation events are causing more and more damage as the climate warms. The top 10 cities impacted by storms are mostly in the Northeast, but Portland and Seattle, both infamously rainy cities, also appear here. Now, let's look at fire. Here, the map shifts dramatically to the west and southeast. This map shows the annual likelihood of wildfire in 2050. The places most at risk of devastating wildfires aren't cities, but instead houses and developments on the edge of wildlands in places with lots of fire.
And it's not just forested areas that are at risk, but also the grass and shrublands of regions like the Great Basin, particularly places that are getting drier. Which brings us to drought. This map shows decreases in precipitation over the last 30 years compared to the 20th century. But what about the future? Well, here are the top 5 cities projected to be impacted by drought in 2050. 4 of them rely on water from the Colorado River, which is already in a decades-long drought, and large water use cuts in the basin are inevitable. Lastly, let's look at the second most common cause of weather-related deaths in the US: heat. This map shows projected days over 100 degrees in 2053. Oh man, Florida, Texas, and Arizona are looking pretty toasty. Phoenix is hotter than anywhere else, but in Florida, temperatures don't need to be as high for it to become dangerous because it's also humid there. That makes it harder for the body to cool itself by sweating. If we take a look at the combined risk of all these climate impacts, we start to see how different regions will fare. And the Southeast will pretty clearly bear the brunt of climate change. And now let's add back in the data we looked at earlier, but this time for the riskiest 10% of counties. At this point, we're beginning to get a clearer picture of some places you might want to think twice about before moving. But are we really any closer to determining the single riskiest place in the country? Perhaps we need to take a look at this issue from a different angle. We reached out to Hannah Hess from the Rhodium Group's Climate Impact Lab, where they study how climate change will affect humans across a variety of categories, including death rates and the amount of time someone can spend on the job working due to temperature.
So what we're looking at on this map is how workers in high-risk industries like construction or agriculture or manufacturing being exposed to higher temperatures during the workday causes them to have to shift their time.
This might mean starting their workday later or ending it earlier, or taking more frequent breaks to cool off and protect themselves from the heat. One thing their research shows is that certain places that already see these temperature extremes more frequently are better adapted and more equipped to deal with elevated temperatures in the future.
In a place like, for instance, Florida is a good example, workers are already relatively well adapted to this heat. A lot of people have air conditioning, a lot of people have figured out ways to cope with extreme heat.
And even though Florida tops the list for hurricanes, these disastrous storms are actually pretty rare in any given location. So maybe we can find an even riskier place.
In contrast, Southern California, Southern Arizona, Texas, a lot of those areas get really, really hot. And one of the highest risk places in this data set is Phoenix, Arizona.
And you might be surprised by just how much the heat there is projected to impact people's ability to work, damaging the city's economy.
An individual worker by the end of the century is projected to spend 78 hours less on the job each year.
So if you put that in the context of a company with, say, 200 full-time workers, that would mean 15,600 lost hours each year. But working hours lost isn't the only important metric for Phoenix to consider. According to the UNDP website, under a moderate greenhouse gas scenario, Phoenix would see an increased death rate of 79 mortalities per 100,000 people from climate change by the end of the century. And to put this into perspective, traffic accidents cause 15 deaths per 100,000 people. So we're talking about 1/5 the number of deaths. And under a high emission scenario, the number of deaths that Phoenix would see is projected to be nearly twice that number, at 148. And the ProPublica study from earlier also projects that under that same high emission scenario, by mid-century, Phoenix could see temperatures in excess of 95 degrees for around half the year. So when you add up all of Phoenix's different vulnerabilities to extreme heat that we've discussed so far, it begins to sound like it might just be the most hazardous place to live in the United States due to climate change, or at least near the top of the list. And another interesting thing about Phoenix and the surrounding county of Maricopa is that it's also one of the fastest growing places in the country. And this means even more people in harm's way and more difficulty adapting to the growing challenges of climate change. But as we mentioned back in the beginning of this episode, when you look at moving trends across the US, the weird thing is Phoenix isn't that weird. Among the 20 fastest growing US metropolitan areas, you'll recognize many of the places we've already discussed because of their climate risks. And almost none of them are in the least risky regions. But to figure out why people are moving to the most hazardous locations, let's start by taking a closer look at why they're choosing to leave the safest ones.
People are leaving these climate resilient areas for economic reasons. On the one hand, you have people leaving because of affordability. They're leaving the West Coast or the East Coast, these coastal markets where home prices have gone up very dramatically. People would love to live in the most climate resilient areas. Like San Francisco, for example, has a very moderate temperature. It doesn't really have risks of hurricanes or drought or anything like that, but people are being forced out of that area into more wildfire risky areas in inland California because of the lack of housing. So yeah, people care about it, but money ultimately is the number one motivator, just being able to afford a home in the first place.
In fact, the top 5 cities in population outflow are all extremely expensive coastal towns. Another especially safe region is the Midwest or Rust Belt, but people are leaving there for a totally different reason.
It's not because housing isn't affordable there. People in the Midwest are leaving due to a lack of economic opportunity because they can't find jobs that pay enough for them to have the standard of living that they want. So they go to places with more economic prosperity.
And what does it say about our country that people are having to move to riskier and riskier places instead of away from them? Jesse Keenan focuses on finding answers to problems like these, and his research shows that a big part of the solution comes down to information.
Our brains are there to run out of the way when a bus is heading our direction or a tiger is running to eat us, right? We're not physiologically oriented for slow violence and incremental notions of risk. So we're just from the get-go impaired in our ability to understand the accumulation of risk. The more information that consumers have access to, the greater likelihood it is going to have that they are going to shift their behavior accordingly.
The availability of this kind of long-term hazard information is crucial. And according to Redfin's data, it is making a difference.
We did find an effect that people who were previously viewing extremely risky homes in terms of flood risk went on to make offers on homes with half the risk once they saw that information. So it seems like it is having a tangible impact on customers. The most important thing we can tell people is just to prepare. And by preparing, we may be able to avoid a lot of the damage, because if a lot of homeowners see that they have really high flood risk, maybe they'll start to mitigate ahead of time, or they'll even band together and ask their local government to do something about preparing for climate change.
So now that we've really dug into the data on different climate risks across the country, what can we say about the riskiest place of all? Well, when you factor in all of the risks that we've talked about, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and the California-Arizona border look like places you should think twice about before moving to. But according to the ProPublica study, there is one county that comes out on top: Beaufort County, South Carolina. This county is at risk of nearly all of the natural hazards, including a couple that we didn't talk about: impacts to crops and wet bulb temperatures. Wet bulb is a big topic to explain here, but for now I can tell you that it refers to the dangerous combination of heat and humidity where the human body becomes essentially unable to cool itself down. But that's a topic for a future episode.
About Sacramento, California, there are a lot of risks: heat, precipitation, drought, wildfire, flooding. It's all nearby. So, what makes a place safe in climate change? And one of the things to look for is a cool place. So, one of the good things about Placer County is that we're projected to have about 30 days uh, over 100 by mid-century, and with a little air conditioning and little preventive activity that might be manageable. Being away from the ocean is certainly a number of criteria, as we have seen again and again. By the end of the century, coastal areas are in dire threat. And then the next one here is access to water. And uh, that's an area of sensitivity here in Placer County uh, because of what's happening with our snowpack as it declines as the century moves along. But for the near future, it looks like we have good access to water in our area. And then elevation and being in the foothills, above the clouds, above the fog, and so on, uh, is one of the assets that Placer County has. So we have another clip.
As the climate changes, we hear so many stories about places in crisis from extreme weather, and many of those places are in the news over and over again. So we began to wonder, where will it be safe to live in 10, 30, or even 150 years? We asked 6 scientists this question, and let's just say,
well, there are really no safe places, right?
But as we dug deeper in our conversations about climate migration, each expert helped us understand where and why people will move in the future. And as it turns out, when multiple environmental risks are weighed together, a prediction about the least risky place to live in the United States is actually possible. At the end of our episode, we're going to call the government of the least risky county in the United States and see what they think about this and if they're prepared. So stay with us, and if you like this kind of science-based perspective on extreme weather, climate change, and how to prepare, give us a like, subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments below. First, let's start by looking at the most basic part of climate change, which we know is that global temperatures are rising. We spoke to 2 different experts who collaborated on a study exploring what they call the human climate niche. And it turns out that humans prefer to live where the average annual temperature is between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
If you picture a band in North America running from roughly Chicago or Boston in the north on over to Seattle, and then down to, roughly say Atlanta, it takes up most of the mid-continent of North America and almost all the West Coast. And the surprising thing to me as an archaeologist is that humans have had that temperature preference for as far back as we can easily go in the archaeological record. That's to say back to about 6,000 years ago. People have always been concentrated within that temperature band.
The 1 degree of global warming we've experienced hasn't caused mass migration in the US just yet. Phoenix is one of the fastest growing and hottest places in the US, but we know the world is getting hotter.
If you look at 3 degrees centigrade warmer world, you find that we could have 3 billion people in a 3 degrees C warmer world living at average temperatures above what's experienced by pretty much anyone anywhere on the planet today, bar a few spots in the Sahara. And I don't think that those 3 billion people would necessarily choose to stay in those kind of extraordinary climate conditions if they had the choice to leave. And that then raises the obvious question of, are they going to come and live with us, inverted commas, and are we going to welcome them in?
Ken Caldera put it in even more specific terms when thinking about temperature and where we'll be comfortable in the future.
The temperature bands moving, I think they're moving something like 30 feet a day. So if you wanted to stay in the same temperature, you need to move 30 feet northward a day. 10 years, you'd on average have to move 20 miles north.
Temperature is important, but I don't think temperature alone is likely to be the first factor to cause climate migration in the US. It seems likely that climate migration will be caused by a mix of factors. Astrid Caldas with the Union of Concerned Scientists put it like this.
With climate migration, people leave because they have to leave after a big disaster that there's no turning back. Their house has been destroyed. They don't have insurance. They don't have the resources. They move to be with, relatives or near relatives, or they go to a place where the cost of living is lower, where they can afford it. They just can't stay where the disaster hit, right?
And climate migration is already happening. Wildfires, hurricanes, and rising temperatures are pushing people to move. As temperatures across the Arctic rise, many Alaskan Native communities have been forced to relocate. And after the Camp Fire burned down over 11,000 homes in Paradise, survivors scattered all across California and the U.S.
The actual boundaries of Earth's land are going to be changing. As our seas rise, we're no longer going to have the same land available to us as was before. And as we lose that ice from the Greenland ice sheet, it actually shows up most strongly at places far away from Greenland. People in, for example, the Gulf Coast of the US are feeling the influences of losing ice. This is causing sea level rise, which includes coastal erosion, salt water from the ocean getting into freshwater resources on the coast. We can also experience flooding not just along the coastal edge of the continent, but also further inland because rising ocean waters can change our groundwater.
So clearly the least risky places are not oceanfront.
Many of the places most at risk of sea level rise will see more hurricanes, and the South will likely get too hot.
We spoke to another expert about an extreme event that causes an increase in climate migration every year: wildfires and the smoke they produce.
In California, a lot of insurance companies are canceling people's homeowners insurance because of the risk of fire. Folks are having to buy a secondary insurance that is cost prohibitive for a number of individuals. It's basically like 5 times the rate of typical homeowners insurance.
So areas with high wildfire risk are out. Actually, John was a part of a study that used 6 risk criteria to rank the climate risk level of every county in the US. We discussed a few of these factors already in extreme heat, sea level changes, and wildfire danger. The study also accounted for economic damages from rising energy costs, real estate destruction, plus low work and crop productivity. So what did they find?
The top 30 least risky counties were found in the Northwest, Michigan, Colorado, Virginia, and a high concentration in the Northeast.
And the one they rated as the least risky? Lamoille County in Vermont. We reached out to Lamoille County and asked them how aware they are of their position as a potential climate haven and how prepared they feel for an influx of climate refugees.
Well, we know it's a lovely place already. So the county as a whole, we've got somewhat less than 30,000 people. The commercial center is probably the town of Morrisville, but again, that's less than 10,000 people. We talk about climate migration a great deal in Vermont. There's been a number of media stories about people moving to Vermont to escape extreme weather on the coast or western wildfires. One of our board members right here moved here from Brooklyn after her apartment flooded after Sandy.
Our apartment flooded, so that was a wake-up call, I think, and we literally ran for the hills. We packed up our life and we moved to Vermont. I'm very aware of the privilege that I had in being able to move up here. And when I do think of myself as a climate migrant, I say that very lightly because I was not fleeing famine. I was not fleeing war. I didn't have to walk with just my clothes on my back and my family across an international border. I didn't have to live in a detention camp. I I got in my Toyota and I drove up here. And I do think Vermont's is making efforts to be a hospitable place to resettling refugees.
We have a lot of work to do to be ready. We have a housing shortage in Vermont, and some of our smaller towns and villages don't have the water or wastewater capacity to really develop a lot of housing. So we're spending a lot of time looking at how we will manage with a lot more people coming here, because we do anticipate that.
But as we look towards our future, how do we prepare ourselves to be as resilient as possible in the face of a changing climate?
So there are many different challenges that we face as the climate changes. And the best way for us both to adjust to the changes that we know are going to come, but also take the strong action needed in order to reduce the pace of change, those are all elements that require us to work together and communicate with each other and really build collaborative spaces from the local level all the way up to the international level. So I really encourage people to think not just about their physical safety, but also the kind of emotional and work spaces that we can create connections in that are really going to help us be able to face these challenges.
Have you or anyone you know moved as a result of extreme weather? Do they think of it as climate migration? And what kind of extreme weather and climate would it take for you to leave your home?
So one of the reminders is that the past won't work for the future. We built these great lives for the needs we had in the past, and we have thriving communities, and folks have homes, and we have businesses and infrastructure that were built for how the world worked a couple decades ago. But the world doesn't work that way anymore, and so there's a discontinuity. What we're used to thinking about, what we thought we knew, how we act, and our expertise, all of that is up in the air now, because now we need to think and act in new ways. And that's a really hard thing for us to get our heads around. In an ideal world, we would be moving much faster to head off further climate change by lowering our emissions, and we would be engaged in a nationwide process of helping people who are most at risk or have already experienced climate migration away from those places. But we aren't there yet. But hopefully the day will come soon where we will be taking more and more serious action to deal with the climate crisis. And on the slide, one of the tools that I learned about is the GEOS Institute provides resources to assist small and mid-sized communities like the one that we live in, develop a strategy for building climate resilience. And I read through the whole manual. It's like 120 pages long, but there are very helpful tools to help us get serious about the consequences of a warming planet. And so here's a reminder from the National Geographic about climate change.
Climate change. It's real, it's serious, and it's up to us to solve it. In the last 2 decades, we've experienced 14 of the hottest 15 years on record. By 2050, drought and chronic water shortages could impact 1 billion people, while millions more will be at risk from coastal flooding. It can seem overwhelming, but there's reason for hope. If we embrace solar and wind power to their full potential, we can cut the world's yearly carbon emissions by 1/3. Already, Germany generates 27% of its electricity from renewables, with a goal of 80% by 2050. Denmark has shown it can produce more wind energy than it can use, and England is building the world's biggest offshore wind farm. Communities large and small are taking steps. A new public building in Mexico City has an exterior that breaks down air pollutants, erasing the effects of 1,000 cars each day. Paris installed street tiles that harvest energy from foot traffic. Other cities are paving streets with smog-eating concrete and sidewalks with recycled materials. Individuals can make a difference too, through the choices we make every day. If every American driver drove 10 miles less each week, it could eliminate more than 100 billion pounds of carbon from the air each year. New innovations are making important strides possible, and more are on the way, but we can't wait. Reimagining our world's energy future will take a shared sense of urgency from countries, companies, cities, and all of us. Working together, real change is possible. Learn more at natgeo.com/climate.
So one of the things we each need to do is what somebody has called climate ruggedization. That is, we take actions to take climate seriously and the way that we live and the resources that we use to reduce the harm that we're putting on the planet and the threat to ourselves and our community. Few of us are ready. We can, however, learn to make ourselves ready. The time to prepare for the accelerating discontinuities of the planetary crisis is now. And the best way individuals and families can gear up is to ruggedize our life. Consumers have a lot of power to adjust their spending habits, what we invest in, and what our concerns are. We vote with our dollars. I enjoy these two fellows who talk to us, sing to us about the importance of switching to electrifying our lives. So off we go.
Americans, please listen to us. We have a question we like to discuss. Do you want to save the world and save a lot of money too? 'Cause you can go electric and leave the CO2. 'Cause did you know 42% of emissions in our lives come from machines in our home and the cars that we drive? It's time to get the fossil fuels out of your home. Call your electrician, pick up the phone. We need to electrify everything. How we heat our homes, how we cool our homes, how we dry our clothes. Electrify everything. How we cook our meals, how we heat our water, how we power our wheels. Electrify everything. What if we told you the things you need are all available, discounted or free? In 2022, an important bill passed called the Inflation Reduction Act. Now inside this bill are a few provisions to help facilitate your green transition. You can get a better air conditioner or solar panels too, and the government will give you money, it's true. There are different rebates you can access through a discount up front. Money back in your taxes. If you don't have lots of money, just sit back. The High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Act. $40,000 you can collect. Your fuel the incentives you can expect. Want to dump your furnace for a new heat pump? Get up to $80,000 to make the bill jump. Get a smart panel regulator, electric flow. 4,000 up, but that's a lot of dough. You can get $1,600 to pay for weatherization, and this discount up fund covers installation. Electrify everything. How we heat our homes, how we cool our homes, how we dry our clothes. Electrify everything. How we cook our meals, how we heat our water, how we power our wheels. Electrify everything. Let's move on to other rebates you can commandeer. Tax credits you can get at the end of the year. Credit 25C and 25D. You can use them with the discount mentioned previously. For a heat pump water heater, you get 2K a year. And 30D gives you even more to cheer. $7,500 for a new EV or truck. $4,000 for a used car and save a buck. If you install solar panels, take a 30%. Better appliances reduce your carbon footprint. Electrify everything. How we heat our homes, how we cool our homes, how we dry our clothes. Electrify everything. How we cook our meals, how we heat our water, how we power our wheels. Electrify everything. For more on how to get all this free money, go to rewiringamerica.org.
Next slide is just a reminder about Rewiring America. It's a great resource on the web to find out ways that you might be able to electrify your life even more and help save the planet. So we're going to end with this brief video clip. I believe everyone in this room can have a prophetic role in addressing the challenge of climate change. And so that's what this clip will tell us.
Some profound stuff here. Appreciate it. Time for discussion. What about this spoke to you? What things were things that you knew already, or things that are new that you want to know more about, do some more research on? This covered a lot of different subjects, really, under the one question about what's the best place to live or the worst place to live. As I said, as we were becoming set up here, David Pogue's book, How to Prepare for Climate Change, addressed a lot of these same questions. I really like what Ken has assembled here in this presentation. It was just, I thought, excellent. Really good stuff. Thoughts, questions? I will carry this mic so that everybody can hear you.
So the first image we saw was a picture of the Earth with the United States or North America and Europe, sort of, and Australia, who produces 79% of the cause of our climate issue. And the last represents all the new things that we should be buying, manufacturing, mining, blah, 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 instead of cutting back. And I'm reminded that hope is fed to those being slaughtered so they will not fight back.
We're all pretty consistent here, William Waters, and some of us are in the environmental movement and have been for a long time, focused on the rivers. I'd say our rivers are actually even doing better for us as a long-term climate solution, and our dams too that we have. And the recreation possibilities of them, the wildlife possibilities of them are just going to explode, just like they have done in the Auburn Recreation Area, where we fought off the Auburn Dam, and the Bear River is now going to be recreation and wildlife zone and better water for the fish, which is what it is out there. Is the campground is closed, and where the fire was started. And nobody wants the campgrounds anymore, but we want wildlife preservation and real fishing, and that's exactly what it is. The state of California is fishing. And also, we're safer because we have great seismic stability here. Like I say, the San Andreas is not our fault. Right. I had a neighbor move in who became a canyon keeper, Laird. He was a petroleum geologist and he moved here because we are the most seismically stable, one of the most. And then the desert is one more safer. But here we are in a zone between the San Andreas and then up into the Tahoe area, the Mona Lake. Those are the falls. We're in the best zone. And there's another thing that makes people move away from seismically safe zones and tsunami safe zones. But he moved to Portland with his wife. And that's old people falling, grandbabies. Yeah. Hobbit sets it's out the window. Right. So totally is different. Yeah. So we have real possibilities here coming up. Canyon Keepers will start next year and do similar stuff on the Bear River.
Thank you. I wanted to piggyback on something Shirley was saying there. One of the things I noticed in the presentation, of course, is it kind of focused on viewers of North America. Those red zones that were cropping up in Africa and other places, and the short comments about those 3 billion people or however many, um, are they going to really sit around and wait to burn up? Probably not. So, what does that suggest about the future and some of the stresses politically, economically, socially? Um, I like coffee, but coffee doesn't grow in Auburn. And the amount of energy it takes to ship coffee beans from Indonesia or Africa or Central America to my favorite Starbucks outlet or factory or whatever, and then to the grocery store, and then to my home. You add up all that energy that got invested in that cup of coffee. That cup of coffee should cost $20, but I don't pay $20. But I'm participating in it when I consume the coffee. Other thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I was, when I first came in here, I thought it was going to be a recommendation to live in the basement or the first floor, the second floor. Uh, but I've been looking for a local company that could change my hot water heater from gas to electric. I don't know whether anybody has a recommendation on that or not, but I checked with several, and they said no, they're not doing that. So, and the other comment I have is about we've got a group that meets in front of the city hall every Friday religiously.
Amen.
And talking about with science and so forth about climate change. I'm just wondering if there's been any data collected on how successful that has been.
I'm not sure how one could create or collect data. Give Shirley the mic there. She has some questions about suggestions.
Some people say that's a waste of time. How informed do people have to be? But one lady came up and said that she was needing to buy a new car, and she drove past us and she said, "Oh, maybe I should look at electric cars too." And she did, and she bought one, and she came back and said, "It's because you guys gave me this idea."
All right.
That's our only data point.
but how much effort it took for her to come back to tell you. We don't know what other influence that you've created. Both parts of that, I think, are important. Yeah. We had an event here uh, that was electrify everything kind of event and a number of parts and so on. And there was a provider, Brower, about who was working more on HVAC systems than water heaters. But Brower might be a source for you to call. I went to Home Depot and they were having a special on electric heat pump water heaters. And the manufacturer's rep was wandering the aisle being available to people. And he had a list of contractors who would actually do the work too. Now that's been 8 months ago. So I don't think he's there still. But some questions about who was that person and who was that masked man and how do we hook up with that? Because they want to sell their product. Yeah. Okay. And let us know what you find out. Good. I think one of the most valuable things we get out of this is sharing experiences, information, questions together. Because you make me think of something I hadn't thought of, and vice versa. And that's really valuable. That's community at work.
I'll add a thought. Our church secretary here, we're in a search for a new secretary because she and her husband are moving to Whidbey Island in Washington because their property insurance got over to $9,000 a year and they decided they needed to move someplace else. And so one of the first things I did when working on this presentation was, how does Whidbey Island fare with climate change? And you may be getting away from forest fire, but you're going into a place with sea level rise and flooding. And so, I think one of the lessons of this presentation is, not even Vermont is probably a safe place to be with climate change. It's going to affect us wherever we live. The very worst place that you could be right now is to be in Africa, and that is very sad.
Mm-hmm. Mary Jo, yes.
So I have a son that lives in Vermont, so I texted him and told him, I guess he'll have to stay there. But I told him Lamoille County was the best place in the country. He said, interesting, because the county has experienced massive flooding the last 2 years.
So it kind of underlines Ken's comment.
Yep.
Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, I had a question. I want to take a poll. What do you all think is the main driver of climate change?
I put it too many people using too many resources, producing too much waste. That's 3 answers, not 1. Sorry.
Yeah.
I would say fossil fuels.
Okay. Well, my answer is the profit motive. I don't see how we can address climate change without addressing the profit motive that's involved in creating climate change.
Yeah. Debt finance is a piece of that because it's loaning out money and resources for repayment with profit that goes back 5,000 years, 6,000 years, and finances wars and empires and all kinds of other things.
Yeah, just one example I can think of offhand is the fossil fuel companies, for instance, are, if you look at the board of directors of a company that advertises on the local PBS station, Cap Radio, uh, Carbon Teravolt.
Okay.
They just got permits to build carbon capture wells in Southern California. The whole idea of carbon capture included in the Inflation Reduction Act climate goals is subsidizing carbon capture and the fossil fuel companies that are using it. I mean, fossil fuel companies lied to us for decades. This is one of their new lies, is that we can continue burning carbon because we have this technology that's going to capture it and put it underground. As Shirley said, you know, we are the main contributors to climate change, and to think that we can maintain a profit-driven consumer culture based on increasing consumption. Every new source has a carbon footprint. It doesn't matter if it's solar or wind or what, it has a carbon footprint. To make the emphasis increasing production so that we can maintain our current level of consumption is not an answer. We should be encouraging the global south, which we've impacted, to adopt renewables as they come online, you know, to become more industrialized. But we don't really have any right to it. What we should be doing is decreasing our consumption and our production. And that's impossible in a culture that's based on economic growth and profit.
There's a book, several books have been written recently, taking what I'll call an indigenous culture viewpoint to our lives. Native American cultures don't do debt, you know, they don't do profit motive, they don't do private property. There's a number of kind of foundational parts of what I'll call developed Western life they don't do. And if we're going to decrease our consumption, it will really help us to adopt some of those ways of life that will allow us all to do better, not just a few of us. Barb?
We have a comment from Zoom just saying, thank you so much for producing this. It's so important. So
Nice. Well, thank the one who thanked us.
But actually, we are increasing our production of everything. Artificial intelligence and bitcoins means now that atomic energy is a good plan. Yeah, radioactive waste forever, right? There we go. Crazy. The greed motive.
Yeah. What we label as progress.
Well,
needs to be
yes,
examined.
Elon Musk does.
Well, it's sold that way, and people grab onto it. Smarter than me, I don't know how to run an AI machine. All right. Well, I think we seem to have come to a stopping place for today. Thank you for coming and being a part of this. Thank you, Ken Moore, for putting this together.